This video is going to help you create graphs using a spreadsheet. I am going to have you create all of your graphs, or pretty much all of your graphs this year, using Google Spreadsheet, because I believe it's a easy way, very efficient way of making very crisp, clean graphs. And you might be kind of reluctant to do it at first. It might take a little extra time at first, but once you get the hang of it, you'll see that it's much easier to not only make graphs, but to make any changes to graphs from data that you're going to be collecting throughout the year. So in this example, I've got some simple data here, a column of time and a column of distance. It's always a good idea to make sure you label your columns so you know what these numbers mean. It's also a good idea to title your file. So here it will be, let's see, distance versus time. That way when you go into your Google Drive later on, you'll be able to find it much easier than looking at a bunch of documents that say untitled document. Once you have your data in here, you can go to Insert Chart up in your menu here. And when I do that, a couple things happen. I get a chart editor that opens up here, and I get a box here that says no data. Now why does it say no data? It says no data because my cell is highlighted outside of my data range. It's okay if that happens. You can always add it later, and it's probably a good idea that it did happen so you can see how we need to change things. Data range. Over here it says B15 because that's the cell that I have highlighted. I want to change that. So I click on this little waffle grid here, and it says what data. I go over and highlight the data that I want, and it automatically puts that range in there. Clicking OK. You can start to see, oh, it sees data now, it's trying to graph it. Now it defaulted to a column chart. That's okay, it's not necessarily what I want now. So I can go over here and change it, chart type. I can make it a line. Not a big fan of lines, more of a big fan of smooth lines if we're going to do that. Again, some of the options that you can use. Scatter plot is often used, and that's the one I actually am going to use. And the reason I'm going to use that is because I want to draw the line in myself later on. So I've got a scatter chart, I got my data range, and there's a couple boxes over here on the side. I can use row 1 as headers. What does that do? Well, sometimes it makes changes, sometimes it doesn't make changes. I would have you experiment with this at times. The best way to learn is to just kind of click on things. Do they help your graph? Do they hurt your graph? What does it do to your graph? So you can click on a lot of different ones over here, and hopefully it'll help you figure out what maybe you need to do in this graph or maybe in a future graph. Clicking on Customize. I was on Data before. Now I'm going to Customize. I can also change the chart style here. I can change the font. I'll just leave it to the default right now. The chart axis and title. Make sure your chart has a title. So here, let's see, I've got time and distance. Well, distance for per unit time is velocity. So I'm going to name this velocity of an object. And one thing that I want you to get in the habit of doing is, in parentheses, put your name in the title. Not my name, your name, but since this is my name, I put Mr. Wakarik in there. And the reason for that is when you're printing this out later on, there's going to be a bunch of graphs that should look similar to each other being printed out. We want to know which one is yours, or you want to know which one is yours. You don't want someone else to take your work and claim it as their own. So I got the text title in there. I can click on this drop down arrow and I can add a subtitle, which I really don't need to do right now, but I also want to make sure I have a horizontal and vertical axis title. So let me start with the horizontal axis title. It's my x-axis, and I want time to be my horizontal axis because time is independent. And remember, you have your independent variable along the x-axis and your dependent variable along the y-axis, and 99.9% of the time when you see time in one of your variables, it will be the independent variable. So I want time, and I also want to include the unit. Okay, it needs a proper label and a proper unit. For my vertical axis, that's my distance in meters. And you can see as I edit it over here, it automatically shows up over here. Again, I can change the font size, size and the characteristics of it. I'm not worried about doing that right now. The series are the actual data points. I can change the color of them. If I don't like the blue, I can change them to red. Keep the blue there. I kind of like the blue. I can change the size. Defaults to these. Don't get your data points too large. They get kind of chunky and it's kind of hard to see exactly where those points are. If you don't like any of the defaults, you can actually manually type it in. Make it 5 point. That kind of works for me. I can change the shape, stars, pentagon, hexagon, squares, whatever. Not worried about doing that right now. I can just leave that as a circle. And I can move on to the legend. Now the legend is this area up here. It's not labeled for me. I could have gone back and labeled it before. I really don't need a legend right now because this is just one series of data. There was just one trial. If I had multiple trials, I'd probably want to keep my legend on there, trial 1, trial 2, trial 3, but I can click on none just to get rid of it. It'll save space and avoid some confusion. Horizontal axis. Okay, this is where you would change the size, the font, color, anything like that. I really don't need that now. Same thing with vertical axis. What I'm going to do is go down to grid lines because I do want to make some changes with my grid lines. If you look, it put just these one grid line for every 20 meters and one grid line for every 2 seconds. It kind of works, but when you're looking at a graph and say I see this data point right here, what is the value of that data point? Well, it looks like it's pretty close to 40 meters, but I really don't know exactly how close because there's a big distance gap between the 20 and the 40 along my y-axis. So what I want to do is I want to keep my major grid line count the same, okay? Because counting by 20s is a nice, neat number increment to count by, but I want to add some minor grid lines. So if I put 2 in there, notice what it did. I went from 20, what is that? Well, that's kind of a weird increment because that's not 30, it's not 25. So let me change that. You always want to make sure these make sense. So when I put 3 in there, that would be 20, 25, 30, 35, 40. That works. That makes sense. So I'm going to leave it 3 on there. And then I want to change my horizontal axis. So now I'm changing my time. 2 kind of works for me, but just for the sake, since we're already here, I'm going to add 1 in there. And that way, 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, I have a vertical line for every second. Easy to count by ones. I can also go through and change my grid line colors. Sometimes it's good to have your major grid lines a little bit darker than your minor grid lines. So I'm going to go through and do that. I'm going to change that to the second one in, and I'll change that to that one. And I can do the same thing with the vertical axis. Make sure the colors match up. And now when I look at my graph, the major grid lines kind of pop off the graph paper a little bit more. It's actually kind of hard to see. So what I want to do is resize this. Notice what I did is I just clicked on the graph so it was highlighted in blue around it, and then I'm dragging from the corners. Get in the habit of dragging from the corners and not from the top or the bottom or the sides. You've probably done this before when putting a photo into a presentation. When you stretch from the sides at the top or bottom, you really can get some distorted images. Not very pleasing to the eye when you're looking at a picture of a person that's stretched out vertically or horizontally, and it also doesn't work with graphs too well. So if you grab it by the corners and resize by the corners, that is a much better way of resizing it. Notice my box went away over here, my editing box. How do I get that back? Well, there's a couple ways of getting it back. I can click on these 3 dots up here and go to Edit Chart, and it comes back in. I can click on Customize, and now I've got it back. Or once I have a graph established, I can just click on what part of the graph I want to edit, and it jumps right to that. So looking at my title's kind of small. So what I want to do is increase my font size to maybe a little bit more than 20. We'll go 24. And my axis labels, my Y and X axis labels, are a little bit small. So let me change those to 18. Looks like it works. And not only the titles, but the numbers themselves. We'll go 16 and 16. So you can edit in the graph as well, as opposed to opening up the chart editor and trying to look for what you want to edit. So we close out of that. And in no time, I've got a graph that looks kind of nice. Okay, I've got a title, I've got labels that are axes that are labeled and have units, and I've got a data series on there. Next step is to print. Now I don't want you to print right out of the spreadsheet. What I want you to do is go to the three dots up here, and I want you to copy the chart. And when you copy the chart, that allows you to bring it into either a Google Drawing or a Google Doc. I prefer Google Drawings, but you can put it in a Google Doc if you want. I like Google Drawings because it's already a landscape format. And once you open this up, you can right click on it or use the menu up at the top and paste. Now it's going to ask you to link the spreadsheet or paste it unlinked. If you link the spreadsheet, what it'll do is if you change your graph, it'll automatically change this file, which you can do. We don't have to because we're just going to be printing this right away. So I'm just going to click on paste unlinked, and now I have that graph in here. You can resize it in here if you want. I wouldn't change it too much because the resolution will kind of get grainy if you make it too big inside this document. And it might be a good idea to center it. So if you right click on it, you can center it horizontally and center it vertically. And now I can send it to the printer.